Okay, so welcome once again to the Sadie and Henry Bayer Chumash class. This is sixth installment of our commentaries unit, and tonight I want to spend a little time learning about the Malbim. The Malbim is a 19th century rabbi, and that requires a word of introduction, because we're jumping past the 18th century. I don't really have an explanation for it, but something happens in the 18th century. It's an amazing century for rabbinic leadership. You have some of the most well-known rabbis in the course of Jewish history, the Vilna Gaon and the Besht and the Pnei Yoshua and Rav Yaakov Emden, up and down, on down the list. And very few of them write commentaries to the Torah, and even the ones who do are not known for their commentaries to the Torah. And in the 19th century, there's a revival, and you have figures like the Malbim and Rav Hirsch and the Netziv and the number of others, certainly who are household names, who are known to us because of their commentaries to the Torah, because of their commentaries to Tanakh. So we're jumping, but if I had to stop you on the street and say, name an 18th century, Bible commentary, so it's hard. You'd be hard pressed. 19th century, there are more options. Okay. So I want to study with you the commentary of the Malbim, and I want to put the Malbim into historic context. Okay, so obviously when the Malbim was born, he wasn't called Malbim; he was called Meir Leibush ben Yechiel Michal Weiser, and it's an acronym. Mem Lamed Beis Yud Mem, Meir Leibush ben Yechiel Michal. That's the Malbim. That's how he became known. Certainly later in life. So the Malbim has a very sad life story. It's really just like a series of tragedies. Very, very difficult life, as we'll learn about in just a moment. Okay, so a little over Meir is born in Loch of a town in Eastern Europe called Woloczysk, something like that. And he's sent as a teenager to study in Warsaw. He was orphaned. His father died at the age of 6. His mother remarried, and destitute family situation. And the orphan, the son of a widow, difficult childhood, sent to Warsaw, known as an Ilui from an early age, recognized right away as someone with extraordinary scholastic potential. Married at age 14. Okay, if you're following at home, that's very young. Married at age 14, and it's disaster. By age 18, he has 2 children, and he's divorced. Things are not going well for the Malbim early in life. So this is the very beginning of the 19th century. We're in Eastern Europe. In 1834, I guess that makes the Malbim around 25 years old. He's already written a sefer, a commentary to the first book in Shulchan Aruch, commentary on Orach Chaim, and he travels throughout Europe, which was not unusual in this time, to make his name known among prominent rabbis in the European Jewish communities, to hopefully get his book some sales. And he travels far and wide. He travels through Pressburg and Trieste and Amsterdam and Breslau, and he sees the world, which, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, is quickly changing. In 1837, he takes his first post as a very small town rabbi in a little shtetl called Reshin. He remarries, and again, another tragedy. The only child of his second marriage dies in childbirth. 1841, he moves out of Reshin, which is not far from Poznan, if you remember the map, and he becomes the rabbi of a slightly bigger little town, called Kempen, okay, which is in present day Germany, I believe. So he's the rabbi of these small towns, and he's an autodidact. Sometimes we know that these important people were students of other important people, and they learned at prominent yeshivas. That doesn't really happen in the life of the Malbim. He teaches himself the Jewish canon, and at the same time, and this is also going to be important, he learns the vernacular. So he learns German, which was not a given. And he also, later learns to read and speak Russian, and he reads widely in the literature of the day, and he becomes very learned in the sciences, in logic, in philosophy, with special interest in Kant, history, and geography. So even though, right, this isn't our picture of the typical Eastern European rabbi, he becomes very learned again, not just in the Jewish canon, but in the general canon as well. 1858, the Malbim was invited to become the rabbi of the Jewish community in Bucharest. In Romania, which at the time was sort of just becoming its own state, and it accepts the position, moves to Bucharest, and in 1860 actually becomes the chief rabbi of Romania. And at the time in Romania, there are already two factions. And we think about 19th century, we think about the growing divide in the Jewish community among the traditionalists on one hand, among the maskilim, the enlightened Jews on the other. And this happens at different paces and in different ways. There's actually a new book that just came out, I think, in the last year called Jewish Emancipation by David Sorkin. And the latest scholarship on how and where emancipation happens, and again, all over the map, it happens in a different way. So in 1860, when the Malbim is hired to become the chief rabbi of Romania, he's actually enthusiastically accepted by both factions. Okay, so the traditionalists say, well, this is a very learned, scholarly, traditional rabbi. And the maskilim say, oh, this is someone who speaks German and reads widely and seems worldly and can empathize with some of the priorities that we have. So things start off okay. And at the time, the maskilim were already making inroads into the agenda that they were trying to promote. So for instance, they were interested in acculturation. They wanted the young Jewish kids to be not only students of Judaism, but students of general culture and general knowledge. They wanted them to attend not a cheder, but the regular government-run schools, what we would call today, public schools. They wanted to engender in Jewish kids a sense of patriotism. They were interested in redesigning their shuls, right? We know this from Western Europe. This was happening much earlier in places like the German-speaking lands, but even in a place like Romania, they already were designing what was known as the choral temple with an organ and with a choir. There was already starting to be some laxity with regards to Shmira Shabbos, with the observance of Shabbos generally. And as you can imagine, when the Malbim shows up in Romania, he takes a very active role in strengthening the traditionalist camp. So he wants to bolster observance of Shabbos, and he wants to set high standards for kashrus, and he builds a communal eruv, and he establishes a printing press in Bucharest so that they can publish Jewish texts and make Jewish knowledge more widely accessible. And he then gradually began to combat the moves of what we would call today the reform movement, which is to say, to get the kids to attend yeshivos rather than the modern Romanian schools, to put a stop to the changes to what the synagogue looked like and the notion that you would have a choir in shul. To prohibit, he started to say, if you're a kosher butcher and you have people who are avowedly maskilim, don't sell them kosher meat. We need to draw a line in the sand, and there needs to be some borders and boundaries drawn so that everyone knows, this is where we hold the line. By 1862, there were already waves being made, and there was already a movement to sack the Malbim. So, without getting into to all of the gory details, the Maskilim responded to the traditionalist views of the Malbim by going to the government and insisting that the government intervened. Okay, which they did. The government said, "That's it. You want to be the chief rabbi of this community? This is not how it's going to work. You are banned from preaching. We're not going to call you chief rabbi anymore." And to the extent that there was autonomy within the community around raising taxes, collecting taxes, so we're taking that away from you, from you as well. Okay, things really got out of hand. These are the stories they don't teach us in day school. We know about what it means for Jews to have faced anti-Semitism. There was a pogrom and they got expelled. But when Jews were fighting with other Jews, I mean, it's really ugly and it's really terrible. Okay, so in 1864, the Malbim was basically physically deported from Bucharest. Okay, as a student of history, so my area is more like 16th, 17th, 18th century, and the sources are much more limited. So you sometimes have a letter, and you sometimes have a pinkas and a communal ledger, and sometimes you'll have a diary. When you get for sure to the 18th, definitely by the 19th century, there's a new source of information, which is a very important and very rich one, and that's newspapers and periodicals. So when something big happens in the world, right, you're not just relying on somebody's memory or somebody's memoir or somebody's letter, but if it got the attention of the public, there's a public record because people were interested and people were writing about it. Okay, so these events, the chief rabbi of Romania, so that's widely known and it's widely written about. And we happen to have an account that the Malbim himself wrote the following year in a Jewish newspaper called Levine. Okay, and you have it in your source sheet. It's source number 1. I'll read it for you in the translation. Okay, this was printed, the Rambam, the Malbim, and I put the source sheet up again in the chat. The Malbim wrote this in Hebrew. He was a linguist, and he wrote a very beautiful Hebrew. He wrote kind of like a little autobiography piece for this Jewish periodical in Paris called Halevanon, and he says what happened to me. He says it was the eve of Shabbos on which we read the Parsha of Amalek. Okay, and he says it was Shabbos Zachor, so this is spring 1864. When the agents of the police came by the order of the minister, they surrounded my house on every side. They took me by force and cast me into the wagon and the cage which they brought. The entire battalion, all the police captains and the guards, the armed men and the patrolmen, the cooks and their servants and their dogs surrounded the cage on every side. It was treatment normally accorded to one of the thieves or the murderers who are infamous and notorious throughout the land. This was by the hand of adversaries from among our own people. They were the ones who destroyed our temple and sold their own brothers into the hands of their adversaries, who shunned them. Okay, so obviously he's speaking in code and in euphemism, but he means his maskilic enemies who denounced him to the government authorities, who in turn arrested him and deported him, forcibly removing him from his post and from his city. Okay, last week I didn't have a Kliyakar joke, so this week I want to do Tashlumin. I want to give you two zingers from the Malbim. Okay, this is the first one, and again, the story could be apocryphal or not. It almost doesn't matter, because it's a perfect reflection of the time, the circumstance, and the personality that we're talking about. So either way, it captures something real. So the story goes like this: it's 1864, and he's leaving town forcibly, and he's saying goodbye to his friends. And one of his adversaries, one of his enemies, comes and says to the Malbim, the Rashi in the beginning of Parshas Vayetze, right? The beginning of our parsha. Good timing for us this Shabbos. He says, the famous Rashi. Let's learn the Rashi, and it'll be an introduction to the story. You have it in sources number 2 and 3 in your source sheet. Very beginning of the parsha, Vayetze Yaakov Beersheva v'yelech Harana. So everyone wonders, Vayetze Yaakov left? You don't have to tell me he left, meaning he went from Beersheva to Padan Aram, wherever he was headed. Why do you have to tell me he left? The strange formulation. So Rashi says, very beautiful Rashi. Source number 3. You just have to tell me Yaakov was headed to Haran. Okay, that's all I need to know. Did he left? What does it matter? You have to know that when a righteous person leaves a place, it leaves a mark, right? Something important is lost when a tzaddik leaves. When a person is a tzaddik and they occupy a particular location, they live in a particular spot. So they're the fame of the city, the grandeur of the place, the splendor of the place. Yatsa misham pana huda, pana ziva, pana hadara. When he leaves, all of that leaves with him. So the story goes that this adversary, maskilic adversary of the Malbim, is standing there as the Malbim is leaving town, and he says, "Look at this, How do you make sense of the Rashi? You're supposed to be such a great person, and here you are leaving town. Look at the town. Looks fine to me. All the grandeur is the same. All the glory, all the fame of Bucharest looks good. And here you are, sayonara." So how did the Malbim respond? So the Malbim said something like this. The Malbim said, "My friend, you have not fully understood the Rashi. Let me explain it to you. This is Vayetze Yaakov. So, Abraham and Yitzchak also left important places. The Torah never says Vayetze Abraham, Vayetze Yitzchak. So what, Yaakov's so different from Abraham and Yitzchak?" He says, "I'll tell you the difference. The difference is when Yaakov left his home, he left behind other tzaddikim. He left behind his parents, Yitzchak and Rivka. They were still in Beersheva. So they would have some appreciation for the fact that another tzaddik had left, right? Because righteous people appreciate the departure of other righteous people. When Avraham left a place, when Yitzchak left a place, they left nobody behind who could appreciate their absence. And so it is today. I'm leaving Bucharest, a city filled with Rishayim. So an important person leaves, they could have no appreciation for that at all, because I leave behind no righteous people in this terrible place." Okay, zinger number 1 from the Malbim, Parshas Vayetze. Can't do better than that. Malbim travels to Constantinople. He tries to get, right, Romania is somehow sort of still under Turkish rule, so he goes to the Ottomans, to the Turks, to see if he can be reinstated, to see if he can get some back pay, because at some level he was an officiant of the government. Moses Montefiore intercedes with the Prussian consulate, and there's a whole story. At the end of the day, maybe he gets some monetary recompense, but he never gets his official title back. And the only way he even can accept the reparations on condition that he officially resign as the rabbi of Romania. He spent some time in Paris and publishes this piece I just mentioned in the periodical Levine. The rest of his life, he dies in 1879. So those final 14 years, he spends in small communities. There's a community called Kherson, back to the town of Lunchitz, where we actually started with the Kliyakar back in Poland, in the 17th century. He's in Mogilev, he's in Königsberg. 1879. In 1879, something else happens a few months before he dies. This didn't make it onto the source sheet, so I just want to put it on your screen. And it comes back to what I mentioned a moment ago, which is, the 19th century, you get newspapers. So you get information that you might not otherwise have access to. Okay, this story is going to come back to New York City. You ready for this? 1879, on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, there are a number of congregations, and they decide they want a chief rabbi. And there's a newspaper article. It's probably end of July, beginning of August. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact date. American Hebrew and Jewish Messenger, one of the newspapers circulating among the Jewish community in the 1870s. And here's the excerpt. Here's the clip. You ready? We've been informed that a movement is on foot having for its object the establishment of the office of chief rabbi and Beth Din for all the congregations of the United States that wish to join it. The Venerable Rabbi M.L. Malbim, having been prevailed on, has finally consented to come and fill the above named office in this country on certain conditions. A preliminary meeting for this purpose will take place on Sunday, August 3rd at 3 p.m. at the Beth Hamidrash Holche Yashar, number 44 East Broadway, to discuss the subject. 32 congregations have already consented to send delegates to this meeting. Okay, they're ready to hire a chief rabbi of America, and they've named the Malbim. Wow, anyone ever heard this story before? It gets better. Okay, so now we have a report that was from before the meeting, and now the meeting happens. And now there's another report from the New York Herald. It's not a Jewish newspaper, it's a general newspaper, but it's interesting because the Jews are hiring a chief rabbi. August 4th, 1879. You ready? This is great, the great excerpt. Here we go. 3 p.m. yesterday, a meeting was to have been held at the Beit HaMidrash Holche Yashar, number 44 East Broadway, at which delegates from 32 congregations of Orthodox Israelites were to appear and discuss the question of establishing chief rabbi and Beth Din for all the congregations of the United States who desire to join the project. At the appointed hour, very few representatives had appeared, and it was decided to postpone the meeting until 4 p.m. Okay, so it's an old problem. We come late. Happens. I guess they weren't Yankees. But one by one, the members of the congregation of number 44 East Broadway and the invited synagogues turned up at the place of the meeting until about 4 o'clock. 28 persons were in the room. One of the members of the congregation said the want of a regular rabbi to fill the office of chief rabbi was very generally acknowledged, and that the Beit HaMidrash Holche Yashar had sent out the invitation to other congregations to meet and consider some plan by which the funds necessary could be obtained to get a regular rabbi. They had already raised $1,500 of a proposed $5,000 to hire chief rabbi. Okay. Are there not proper rabbis here? The reporter queried. What are you doing? Don't you guys have rabbis? There are men who act as such and are very able men, but each congregation has its own rabbi. What is wanted is a proper chief rabbi to whom all questions and dispute could be referred. Basically, they wanted someone primarily to handle Hilchos Kashrus and to create a universal system that would be acceptable. Whom do you propose to get? Rabbi M.L. Malbini. Okay, I think that's probably a typo. He's a regular rabbi and is now at Königsberg in Prussian Poland. He's a very able man and would fill the place properly. He's been a rabbi in Moldavia and in Russia. Will he accept your offer? Yes, he has accepted the offer made to him by letter, but he will only come if he is received by all or the majority of the congregations. If he comes, although he would be only nominated chief rabbi of New York, yet all other congregations in the states could, and we believe would, subscribe toward the maintenance of his office. 4 o'clock, chairman called the meeting to order and announced the meeting was simply a preliminary one and asked those not having invitations to withdraw. Okay, so we don't really know if he accepted the offer, but an amazing part of this story, which I think is not well known. They were ready to hire the Malbim to be the chief rabbi of New York. Eventually, they did hire Rabbi Jacob Joseph for a short time, was chief rabbi of New York. The goal was to hire the Malbim, be chief rabbi of New York, chief rabbi of America, but irrespective of whether or not he provisionally accepted or accepted, he passed away a few months later at the age of 70. And it never came to fruition. Okay, so let me just pause here and ask if there are any questions about the life and times of the Malbim, and then I want to say a few words about his commentary, which we'll look at together in a minute. Okay, so let me say a couple things by way of introduction about the Malbim's commentary to the Torah. A nice sort of summation by one of my professors at Revel, Professor Mordechai Cohen. He writes in source number 4, he says, Malbim adduces scripture's profound wisdom by projecting 19th century science and philosophy from new discoveries in medicine and astronomy to Kantian epistemology onto the biblical text. Very knowledgeable man, and he uses the wisdom that he's acquired to explain Tanakh, aiming to offer an intellectually viable traditional alternative to modern critical biblical scholarship. Malbim, a fine Hebraist, employed a pshat methodology. What is the Malbim's principal contribution to scholarship on the Torah? So a word of introduction before we get to the Malbim on the notion, if you take away one word from tonight's class, the word you should take away that you should associate with the Malbim is omnisignificance. Omnisignificance. What does the word omnisignificance mean? James Kugel, well-known Bible scholar at Harvard, once wrote the following, and I think he coined the term. He says, what does it mean? Source number 5, the slightest details of the biblical text have a meaning that is both comprehensible and significant. Nothing in the Bible ought to be explained as the product of chance, or for that matter, as an emphatic or rhetorical form, or anything similar, nor ought its reasons to be assigned to the realm of divine unknowables. Every detail is put there to teach something new and important, and is capable of being discovered by careful analysis. This is the premise, this is the basis for everything that the Malbim writes. There is no extra word. There is never a time, neither in the Torah nor in Nevi'im, where something is written for emphasis or poetic flourish or for literary style or for rhetorical, score rhetorical points. Never happens. If the Torah uses two words, it's for a reason. They're not the same. And the Malbim says, I'll explain to you exactly why. And at great length, this is precisely what the Malbim does. You can see he writes as much in source number 6 in his introduction to Sefer Yeshayahu. I'll give you a couple of examples to help reify this point. Okay, source number 7 from the end of Sefer Bereshis. Yaakov is giving brachos. I put in quotation marks. Giving brachos to his children. I put in quotation marks because some of them don't sound exactly like their blessings. Okay, so let's learn source number 7 together. You ready? This is the pasuk. We're just going to half a pasuk. Arur apam. Yaakov is talking to his son Shimon and Levi. Arur apam ki az ve'evrasam ki kashasa. So arur apam ki az ve'evrasam ki kashasa. Cursed be their anger so fierce, and their wrath so relentless. Okay, and really what it means is cursed be their anger so fierce, and arur apam ki az, and arur, it's implied, and cursed be their wrath, which is so relentless. So what's the difference? I'm saying a lot of people who have read this passage would say it's a flourish. It's like poetic flourish. You say the same thing in two different ways, and that itself adds meaning. But you want to tell me there's a difference between apam and The Malbim says, yes, there is a difference, and I'll tell you exactly what it is. The notion of anger and wrath, they're not the same. Source number 8. V'yesh hevdel ben af uven evra. They're two different things. She'af hu ma shekotzef al mi shechata kenegdo. Okay, anger means you're angry at the person who has wronged you. There's a personal stake. That's what anger means. Ve'avra hu im al yedei ze yishulach harono gam al mi shelo chata. And wrath, and again, the English translations are almost beside the point, but the second word, separate and distinct from anger, is not directed at someone who has wronged you personally. It's the collateral damage. Neged Shechem ben Chamor haya'af. He said, Shechem ben Chamor, who raped your sister, Shimon and Levi, that's your anger, right? And I'm cursing your anger, but I'm also cursing your wrath. V'neged Yeser anshe Shechem hayavra. What did they do wrong, right? They didn't harm your sister. They didn't harm you. They're just occupants of the same city of this terrible guy. So the fact that you got angry at them, that's a totally different feeling. That's a totally different reaction, and it's expressed by a totally different word. So, it was not that long ago that we just finished the Yom Kippur, Yomim Noraim season. So we always say, Slach lanu, Mechal lanu, Kaper lanu. Rambam says, Slicha, Mechila, two totally different things. He says Slicha, and again, he'll adduce 100 proofs because he knows all of Tanakh by heart. He's a genius. He'll say Slicha, the notion, when we say, forgiveness, Slicha is for Hashem. Only Hashem can absolve your sin. That's how he would translate it, because he's the ruler of the universe. Other people could mochel, they could forgive you, they could let it go, but they can't absolve you of a sin because it's not theirs to absolve. They're not the divine scorekeeper. That's only Hashem. I'll give you one more example, just in the interest of time. I'll summarize it. You have it here in source number 9, 10, 11. Okay, it's a great comment because it explains something that almost nobody else can explain. You remember the story of Bilam at the beginning of Parshas Balak? Hashem appears to Bilam and says, "Don't go." And then Bilam says, "I really want to go. What if I can? Is there any way I could go?" And he has a conversation. Then Hashem appears again, and he says, "Well, if this and that, then you could go." So. 1 second, I thought a minute ago he said, don't go. So what exactly is the difference? And the Malbim says you have to look very carefully at the words of the pasuk. They're not the same. Right? One pasuk says, Lo selech imahem, don't go with them. And again, totally gets lost in translation. Don't go with them. And then in the next iteration, it says, Kum lech itam, go itam, with them. Imahem, with them, itam, with them. We don't even have words in English to differentiate those two terms, right? I'm not aware of any translation that would pick apart the difference between imahem and itam, except the Malbim says they're not the same. Imahem means with them, not just practically, but in mission and in purpose. You are totally with them. Imam means you go with them, but you have your own and you have your own purpose, and that explains. The contradiction between these two psukim, right? When Hashem said don't go, he meant don't go on their mission. If you want to go with them, you could go with them. You just can't subscribe to their mission. And that's, again, exactly what happens. Bilam does go with the messengers of Balak. He's able to subscribe to the mission because Hashem has a different plan for him. Okay, so the second point I want to share with you that is equally important. Point number one. The Malbim is always interested in demonstrating the precise meaning of every word in the Torah to the exclusion of any possible synonym. There is no such thing as a synonym for the Malbim. Okay? Point number one. Point number two comes back to the Malbim's lifelong dispute with the maskilim. I wanted to share with you a couple of comments that the Malbim makes in his introduction that shed light on what it is he set out to do in a large part of his commentary. Interestingly, the Malbim began his commentary in Sefer Vayikra. You open up the Malbim on Bereshis, you don't find anything. There's no Hakdama, there's no introduction. He just jumps into the commentary. That's because when he began writing with the book of Vayikra, and it's very important and it's very telling, because more important than the stories for the Malbim were the halachos, were the laws dictated by the Torah, and Vayikra is almost exclusively a book of laws. There are two narratives in the whole of Vayikra. Everything else is law. Much of it is not applicable. A certain portion of it is not applicable in the absence of the temple, but it's a book of law. Okay, and that's going to be very important. So let's just look, if you have it handy, you can pull it up in the chat on your source sheet, sources 12 and 13. Source number 12 is a very important formulation. He says this all the time. I just picked one spot where the Malbim says this. It's such a postmodern formulation. It's amazing that somebody could write such a thing in the 19th century. He says, Her'esi ubararti b'movsim ne'emanim, ki hadrush hu hapshat hapashut hamuchrach v'hamutba be'omek halashon v'yisodei hasafa ha'ivriya. Okay, and I took a little time to just translate it, to translate it precisely. What he means is the following. He says, I have demonstrated, and I will demonstrate in my running commentary, I have demonstrated with faithful illustrations that the homiletical interpretation, the drash, is actually the simple and natural interpretation stated by an understanding of the depths of the language and the foundations of the Hebrew language. We have these two worlds, right? Pshat and drash. Drash, the midrashic, commentaries of the rabbis. Pshat, how you can read the text based on its own context and its own language without recourse to drash. The Malbim says, what's happening? The drash is the pshat. The drash is the pshat. And it's so important. I'm going to flesh it out in a second. But his big goal in writing these commentaries is to demonstrate. You think this medrash is so far-fetched, and it's an allegory, and it's a story, and it comes out of nowhere. He says, if you knew anything, you maskilic readers of the text, if you knew anything about the origin of Hebrew language and the rules of grammar and syntax and the nuances of Lashon HaKodesh, you'd see that the rabbis weren't pulling anything out of thin air. It's totally obvious for all to see. You think that extra hey, the rabbis came up with a whole fancy interpretation because there's an extra hey. He says, it's not a fancy interpretation. If you know any of the rules that I'm going to lay out for you, you'll see that it's patently obvious. And he actually lays out, you ready for 613 operative guidelines, operative principles. I didn't read all 613, but he says, these are the rules I'm going to operate by. And then he writes his commentary to the Torah, and he does it. So he writes in source number 13. And in the interest of time, I'll just bold it for you. But he says, this is what I'm up against, and this is what I'm trying to accomplish. He says, the bold in source number 13, okay, in these days, it's an emergency situation, right? That's the line from Tehillim Kuf Yates. It's an emergency. We have to take matters to another level. Eis lasos Lashem. Eis lasos l'torah shebechsav v'shebal peh choma b'tzura saviv d'lasayim v'vrech kol bal yalu ba pritzim v'chalu. We've got to make a fence around the Torah. They're going to crush it. They're going to wreck it. We got to save the Torah. Shebechsav, Torah shebal peh, the oral Torah, the written Torah. We got to do this. And I'll tell you why. Im l'torah shebechsav asher damuha hida hara hazos ke'achad misipurei amim hakadmonim. He's speaking in code. What he's saying is the maskilim have turned the text of the Torah into literature. It's like we're reading Homer. Like they think about it, they study it in the same way that they would study a Greek classic. So I'm here, he says, to defend the classic and traditional interpretation of the text against those who would see it just as literature, something devoid of holiness. He says that they treat the Torah Shabbat as like it's just a mashal, it's a parable, it's a metaphor, as if it's nothing. Okay, and he says my job here is to defend the tradition, to defend the traditional rabbinic interpretation of the text, and to show you how it's not pie in the sky, but it's the real deal. And he actually cites in the part that I didn't bold. Says that there was this rabbinical conference in Braunschweig in 1844. The reformers got together and they said, Kol Nidre, we don't really need Kol Nidre. They said, we'll do away with Kol Nidre. And they said, marrying a Jew, okay, maybe in an ideal world, but Bisman Hazeh, as long as you marry someone who's a monotheist, right? That's good enough. Okay, so again, it wasn't just like at the margins that the Malbim was fighting this fight. He was on a crusade to defend traditional Judaism against what he perceived to be an existential threat. You ready for the second zinger? This is from Schneur Lineman. He once told us this story. It goes like this: that the Malbim was somehow at one of these ecumenical conferences. They were both traditional and maskilic rabbis. And the person who spoke before the Malbim was a maskil. And the Malbim started his talk by saying, Rabbi so and so, I want to thank you so much. You helped me understand something that I've been troubled by all my life. What have I been troubled by all my life? He says, the famous couplets in Koheles, the time to be born and the time to die. He says all those couplets, so they represent extremes, and in all cases, there's a golden mean, there's a shvil hazahav, there's something in between. Eis sefod ve'eis lirkod. There's a time to eulogize and a time to dance. There's something in between, just relating to you as a normal person. He says there's one line just doesn't fit the pattern. Eis lachashos ve'eis ledaber. There's a time to be silent and a time to speak. It doesn't make any sense because they're absolutes. Either you're silent or you're speaking. And he said, finally, now you help me understand the line, because now I understand that it's possible to speak and say nothing. Okay, so that's the Malbim, and that's his. And you have to understand and appreciate the context, right? Maybe it's true, maybe it's not true. It doesn't matter, right? This is what the Malbim was up against, and his whole being, right, coursing through his veins was this notion of there's an existential threat to everything that I hold dear and everything that I believe in. If I don't stop this, thing called the Haskalah in its track, we could lose Jews by the droves. I have to defend the tradition. And what I have to do in my commentary is show everyone, right? You're a reader of the text and you think, Rashi, it's the craziest thing. What are you telling me? No, it's not crazy. It's actually obvious. And if you give me a minute to explain why, I'll show it to you. Okay? So I'll just give you a couple of examples, and then we can turn to our parsha for a couple more. This one's just on my mind because I mentioned it when our introduction to Yoval. It's a Gemara on a Medrash on the pasuk in Parshas Kedoshim. This is source number 14. The pasuk says, "B'tzedek tishbot amisacha." You have to judge your favor. You have to judge your fellow with justice. And the Medrash on that line, the Sifra on that line, says, "B'tzedek tishbot amitacha habidanis kol adam." You want to judge your fellow with justice. What does that mean? You should judge them favorably, give them the benefit of the doubt. So what does that have to do with the price of tea in China? Meaning tzedek means right, wrong, and just, meaning the idea is to be fair. It's not to give people the benefit of the doubt. How did you get from A to B? So the Malbim says, no, you have to understand that the word tzedek has another layer of meaning. The word tzedek also is related to the word tzaddik. So whoever is standing in front of you, you have to imagine that they might be a tzaddik, in which case you have to give them the benefit of the doubt and assume that their actions, right, until proven otherwise, are righteous. Again, not pie in the sky. It's based on the text. It's based on the word. What you find beginning in Sefer Shmos is that more often than not, and this is stunning, you don't see this really in any other commentary that we generally talk about or think about. The Malbim is not commenting, I should say, on the text of the pasuk. You know what he does? He quotes the Medrash at length, and then he says, I'm going to explain what the Medrash is doing in relationship to the text. In Sefer Bereshis, that happens much less. But the general rule for the rest of the Torah is that the Malbim is more than his interest in explaining the text, is his interest in explaining how the Medrash functions in a coherent and cohesive and synchronous way with the Torah Shebichsav. The time that we have left, I want to give you a couple examples from our parsha, so that you can see how the Malbim thinks and how the Malbim operates. And really, just to give you a sense of how the Malbim would attach significance to every line and make sure that you know that there is no extra word in the Torah. Every word serves a purpose. So remember, beginning of Perek Chavtes, Yaakov is about to meet Rachel at the well. He breaks up this conversation with the shepherds, chatting with them, and he says, what are you doing here? And we're waiting. And why do you have to wait? Because there's this stone on top of the well. And do you know Levine? Right. So just look. I didn't have a chance to get into this, but if you look at source number 18, so this harkens back to Yabar Minah. The Malbim thinks of the Torah and conceptualizes the text of the Torah in units. We'll say, I want to talk about the following 5 psukim, whatever the case may be. And he says, I have the following questions on this unit. It's 1 question, some 2 questions. And he says, and then let me explain the psukim, and in the course of explaining them, I'll answer these questions. So look at source number 18. So the Malbim has just read the beginning of this chapter. And he says, you know, my question is, this whole story, I don't know, it took up 6, 7, 8 psukim. To the well, and he starts chatting it up with the shepherds. Point of that story. The point of the story, namely, Yaakov met Rachel at a well. I need these 9 other psukim with chatting it up with the local shepherd. Who cares? The Malbim says, I'll explain it to you. I'll explain to you the significance of this conversation in the Torah. Okay, so let's take it away. If you have it, this is source number 19, line by line. First, the Malbim says the following. So Yaakov starts by asking these guys, where are you guys from? Begin with the end. His end goal was to chastise them and wonder why they're standing around loitering at the well when they should be out watering their flocks. And he says, the Torah takes us through his line of reasoning, because maybe, speaking of Dan Lakab's chus, speaking of giving people the benefit of the doubt, maybe there's a rhyme and a reason as to why these shepherds are standing about and standing around. He says maybe they came from a faraway place and they're tired. Or maybe they have to get home first and there's no more time in the day. So first he asked them, where are you from, to establish whether or not they're locals. It was all set up to find out if they had any decent excuse as to why they're here. Once he finds out that they're from Haran, there's no excuse. Now he takes an opportunity, because presented it to ask about Lavan. Hayadatem es Lavan. Do you know Lavan? Ha'ish yodea lakol, o mirov ashro o shalvaso, o mirov anav, o beshu ish riv umadun, yadanu shal hashalom lo. She says, do you know him? That's going to establish whether or not he's a known person. Why would someone be known? Either because they're very content, or they're very wealthy, or they're very cantankerous, and they have a lot of energy. There's going to be a reason if someone is known to the locals. And they say, Yadanu. Kisha'amru Yadanu, when they say that, Sha'al Shalom Lo. Yaakov continues, now line by line, he says, there's a reason for everything. How's he doing? Is he at peace? Im yodim oso mizeh hatzad sheshalom lo begufo v'mamono v'im kol adam v'yeshivo ki shalom v'haraya asher echel bito ba im atzon levadav ein yireh min haroim ki bnos Yisra. Fascinating observation. He says, what does the answer tell him? The answer tells him, right, that everything is fine and everyone is safe. He says, if you know, fast forward to the story of Yisro's daughters, when Moshe finds them at the well, dangerous for young shepherdesses to be with their flocks at the well. Other shepherds come, they harass the young women. It's not safe. Except that Yaakov finds out right away from the top that things must be going very well for Lavan, and it must be a safe neighborhood and a safe community, because look who's coming, out by herself, a young unmarried woman. Had it been any other circumstance or any other context, that never would have happened. Continuing, two more comments of the Malbim. Vayomer Rotzelomer Hine Masha Ein Holchim Liros Yitzuar O La'es Erev O Beis Hatzarayim Shachom Gadol V'Osim Matzon L'Makom Echad Sheyesh Bo Tzel Neged Eis Erev Amar Hein Oda Yom Gadol. So now the Malbim tells us that Yaakov says back, right? Each detail is taken into account. It's the afternoon, indicating there's plenty more time. V'neged eis hatzarayim she eis harevitza k'mashkasav eichat harbitz v'tzarayim amar lo eis ha'esav miknevim kain yishkrat. Everything indicates that these guys are waiting around when they actually shouldn't be. Last line. Odenu medaber. He's still speaking, and all of a sudden Rachel shows up. Siper eich he's min Hashem shetzeitzei batzugo v'imtzeu so al ha'be'er keyitzchak u'Moshe. It's all set up. You have to see the divine hand in this, that Hashem allows. And Hashem's guiding hand allows his intended to show up at the well, just as what's the case for Yitzchak and later on for Moshe. Now this is fascinating, right? No one ever thinks about this. What's the significance of the sheep? The significance of the sheep is that these are the sheep from which Yaakov is actually going to accumulate great wealth in the continuation of the story. And by the way, I think this is a stunning observation. V'agav neida mizeh, shelavan haya'ani va'es hahi. He says, you know what else you could derive from the details of this story? That Lavan was a pauper when he first met Yaakov. Achar shebito haktana ra es kol tzono. His little daughter, his young daughter, we don't know how old she is, his young daughter is shepherding in the entirety of his flock. In which case, right, how many sheep could there be? Right? How wealthy could he be if she's shepherding his entire flock? There's no servants around. There's no other staff people around. There's no other workers around. This is how you know by the end of the story, from the fact that Lavan ended up as a very wealthy man, it was all derived before Yaakov came into Lavan's life. All the evidence is right here in the text that in point of fact, Yaakov was a pauper. There's not an extra word, there's not an extra detail in this whole narrative. Everything carries significance. I'll conclude with one final comment from our parsha. Go back to the text for 1 second. You have it here in source number 17. You ready for this? It's such a minute detail. We'd never be sensitive to this. The Malbim's all over it. Verse 10. Vayihi kasher Yaakov es Rachel, bas Lavan achi imo, v'etzon Lavan achi imo, v'yigash Yaakov v'yagel ha'sa'ed mimnei al pi ha'pe'er, v'yashket etzon Lavan achi imo. Yaakov impresses her, he rolls the stone. Vayishak Yaakov l'Rachel vayisas kol havayef. He kisses her and he cries. Vayagei Yaakov l'Rachel ki achi aviyahu v'chi ben Rivkahu b'tzaretz v'taged la'aviha. Okay, Yaakov tells Rachel exactly who he is, the whole family dynamic and the family relationship, and she runs and she tells her father. He hears that Yaakov, his relative, has come. He runs out, he greets him, he hugs him, he kisses him, he brings him in. And Yaakov tells Lavan everything. Totally lost in translation. There's a different word. In verse 12, how do you say to tell? Vayaged. Vayaged Yaakov l'Rachel, v'taged la'avia. Everyone is telling something. And then all of a sudden, verse 13, it's the same people. It's Yaakov. So why vayasaper l'Lavan? It should be vayaged l'Lavan. Why a new word all of a sudden? I'll explain it to you. Source number 20. Vayasaper l'Lavan yesh hevdel ben Haggadah l'Sipur. They are not the same. And again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. He'll give you 100 proofs. He'll line them up in each column how this word means X, the other means Y, and it's always the case. You could take this with you for the rest of your life. When you see the word lahagid, it means one thing. We'll see in a second. The word lasaper means something else. Subtle difference. When it comes to the word Haggadah, if I'm telling you lahagid, it's something personal. It's something that has a consequence or an effect on the people involved in the conversation. When it came to the conversation between Yaakov and Rachel, so it's Yaged, because there was a personal stake. It meant something. He cared about her. It was his intended. He was going to marry her. The saper is to tell something that is not directly related to me. It's distant, removed from the personal narrative. Lahagid is between me and you. Lasaper is, I'm telling you a story about somebody else. It actually reveals something about how Yaakov felt about Lavan. From the very get-go, it wasn't personal. There was no deep connection between the two, and so the formulation of how Yaakov relates to Lavan is distant, it's removed. It's not lahagid, it's l'saper, the way you would tell a story to a stranger, not the way you would reveal a secret to someone you care about and someone that you love. These are the two great contributions of the Malbim. Omni significance, the sense that every word in the Torah has an explanation and a meaning, and there are no synonyms. Contribution number 2, to make the text defended, to create a wall, as the Malbim himself writes in his introduction, to defend the Torah and the rabbinic tradition in interpreting the Torah against those who would claim, it's all pie in the sky. The real explanation is the pshat. You just have to know the words. The Malbim says, I know the words. I know them better than you, and the drash is the pshat. If you just understand more deeply what the basis is, you'll understand that the rabbinic tradition is in fact rooted in the deeper meaning of the text, and it just requires explication. Please God, we'll pick up next week, and I wish everyone an early happy Thanksgiving.